Hey, everybody. Thanks for being with us as we close out the week here in the Gospel of John. Continue to work our way through the first chapter. A little bit of a change of pace. The first 18 verses really function for John as a theological underpinning. Not that John is done with theology by any stretch, but now we do begin to get into some narrative, some story. And we pick that up today in verse 19 as we again meet this character that has been referenced, not really, as we meet for the first time, this character that has been referenced, John the Baptist here, not the author. So this is the description of what John is up to, what he's been doing, what he's been saying. And it's an interesting place for the story to start. We'll come back to that after I read a few verses here. Starting 19. This is the testimony given by John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask, "Who are you?" He confessed. He did not deny it, but confessed, "I am not the Messiah." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I'm not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." And they said, "Who are you? Let us have an answer for those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I'm the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord." In all of the Gospels, John the Baptist is a key figure. Particularly shows up early in the story. He is the herald. He is the forerunner, the one who goes before. John gives us I think in some ways, the crispest or the clearest conversation with John. John starts with the question, "Are you the Messiah?" That's the first thing we hear him say. "I am not the Messiah." So we know that there was in the early church a group of people who followed John the Baptist. Right here, we're going to hear in this story as it unfolds, disciples. John the Baptist has disciples, people who are with him and follow him. We know that he also has a large following of people who come out to hear him preach and get baptized. And yet, the first words in this story from John the Baptist are, "I am not the Messiah." And that's a significant point for the way that John the author tells this story. And as we meet this character, Michael, there's a sense in which the other Gospels build us up to this moment, I think a little slower. Mm-hmm. John just starts right off with it.
Yeah, right. And the reason that John is so important, and we've said this before, but now as we turn our attention to John the Baptist, the reason that he's such an important character and is given such prominent place so early in this story is because he is witnessing, he's confessing. And we see this specifically, the word that we have in this translation is the testimony given by John. And that word testimony is used 37 times in the New Testament. 30 of them are used in the Gospel of John. That is how important that this theme is within the whole Gospel. And it's why it is given such prominence and why John the Baptist is given such a clear place within the story so quickly, Clint, is because he is the chief testifier. He is the one with good character, with a humble attitude, shows up on day one, and from the start, he confesses, "I'm not the Messiah, I'm not Elijah, I'm not the prophet. The one who is coming after me, we're going to find, that's the one who's greater." So I just want to make sure that we see right from the start that John prepares the way for Jesus, both in terms of the people's imagination, and he's going to call the people to a form of repentance in the story to come. But what we have right here is very, very clearly that John is the first character of the story, verse 19, who's already giving us that testimony. He's giving us that witness. He's setting the tone of how the characters of the story are going to all in their own individual ways be witnesses and testimony bringers of the gospel of Christ.
Scholars suggest that because we jump into this story like this, it's an indication that the Gospel of John is written to people who are already pretty familiar with John the Baptist, his message, this conflict or controversy of whether he's the Messiah. the growing conflict with Jewish leaders, that it makes sense if you just think about it, given that there's no real prelude to this, there's no explanation given, that this question is already on the forefront in the very first part of the gospel. It seems reasonable that those who are the intended receivers of this gospel are familiar with those things. And so John does this fairly comfortably, just leaves out some details. And when that happens, we're left with the assumption that those who are reading the gospel probably already knew those details and didn't need them. There will be other places that John will fill in some gaps, but when he doesn't, we assume it's because those things are already known. The answer that John gives here is also wonderful. They say, well, then who are you? And he answers, I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, which is a quote from Isaiah chapter 40. And one of the wonderful things about some of these quotes is that they didn't live with a lot of expectation. It wasn't understood that Jesus or that John knew what these things meant in the broader context. In other words, they weren't picking verses that were well known by people and had established meanings. A similar reality would be Jesus calling himself Son of Man, which is a fairly obscure title in the Old Testament and not one that carried a lot of baggage with it. So John says here, I'm the forerunner. I'm the voice that cries out in the wilderness, make straight the ways of the Lord. In other words, I'm, as you said, Michael, I'm the one who testifies. I'm the one who announces. I'm the one who tells the truth about the one who is coming after me and is greater than I am. And this is what gives John the Baptist his flavor, especially in this gospel, the herald. And he has this essential role that he plays, and we jump straight into it.
There's also another introductory note that I think is pretty subtle here, and I don't want to pass by it with us missing it. In verse 20 there, when he confesses and doesn't deny, but says, I am not the Messiah. Now, if you've not read the Gospel of John yet, that may just sound like a denial. But if you've read the Gospel of John, you might know that to come, Jesus will several times make I am statements. Jesus will say, I am the bread of life. I am the vine. I am. Jesus repeats these I am statements, affirming who he is. It's fascinating. At the very beginning of the book, one of the first words offered by the one who gives witness is, I am not. I am not the one who is going to come. And this just, as you see the richness of this text later on, we're going to discover that Jesus is all of the things that these human witnesses could not be for themselves. And what's so amazing about John, I think the telling of John the Baptist is that he is not competing for attention. He's not looking for notoriety. He's not seeking popularity. And he's also not looking to be raised up to high religious power. What John wants to do is to point others to the one who represents God in flesh, who is the one that has come to save the world. And that is the beautiful witness that sets off the tone. And, you know, if you're going to think about gospel starts and you want to think about the beginning of Jesus's story, I think most of us, Clint, we think of the Christmas story. We think of angels and shepherds, and we think of nativity scenes and all these things. But in the Gospel of John, the most important introductory character is none of these. It's rather a person fully grown, simply recognizing Christ for who he is and giving witness to those who come asking about him, saying, this is who Jesus is. He is the Messiah. And that is an amazing sort of opening invitation to what's going to follow.
We've noted this before, but the other thing that's sort of noticeably absent in John's gospel is, at least at this point, prophecy. All of the other gospels equate the coming of Jesus with predictions and forecasts. The closest we get here is this reference to Isaiah, but it's fairly minimal. And so John tends to focus on the moment at hand and tells the story with a kind of current urgency. And so that's what we have here. Who are you? I'm the one making straight the way of the Lord. And we don't get, nor do we need a lot of reference for what that means. We continue verse 24, the next couple verses. So they asked him, they had been sent from the Pharisees, and they asked him, why then are you baptizing if you're neither the Messiah, nor Elijah, nor the prophet? John answered, I baptize with water. Among you stands one whom you do not know, the one who is coming after me. I'm not worthy to untie the thong of his sandal. This took place in Bethany, across the Jordan from where John was baptizing. So here we have this reference to John being the baptizer. We call him John the Baptist, but baptizer is probably a better translation of some of the titles, at least as they often appear in the Greek. He's the one who baptizes. In baptism, there's history out there. You can get into it. We won't take the time to dive deeply into it. It was not a practice that John established. It had grown in some popularity, but it wasn't a widespread practice among the Jewish faith, though in small places, in certain places and in small minorities, it was practiced. And here, John seems to have had a great following of people who responded to it. The idea was repentance. The idea was turning away from your sin, of being washed. It had that kind of symbolism in it. It is not inherently Christian, though it becomes fully Christianized in the wake of the gospel and in the testimony and work of John the Baptist. And really, his place in the story cements baptism as a kind of Christian ritual that ends up becoming one of the things we even call sacrament.
So actually, baptism is one of the components of this that is so confusing to the religious leaders who come, because we have the Pharisees, and you may know that the Pharisees represent a group within the Judean faith that was taking very seriously the moral law, the sort of handing down of the faith, and trying to live that out in very concrete ways. So here, baptism in the Jewish tradition, as certainly the Pharisaical interpretation of it, was connected to the end times. It was connected to everything being fulfilled. And so here, they at this point in the story are likely asking this as a legitimate question. There's likely not a whole lot of sort of argument or force behind it yet. Out of curiosity, if you're neither the Messiah nor Elijah nor the prophet, then why are you baptizing him? And when John answers, this is an amazing statement. I baptize with water. And one commentator makes the point of saying this is written to almost have the force, I only baptize with water. And that is the amazing kind of witness and testimony we see in John, a kind of really unparalleled humility of a person from day one who is not striving for self. I think of someone like Peter, another example of a very prominent biblical character. And we know, as we see Peter's story told in the Gospels, that he struggled to hear what Jesus was saying. He often got off place, either trying to build a tabernacle for Jesus, or he was trying to gain power and privilege in the places where they were. Here, John the Baptist is simply out in the wilderness. And here, this place, Bethany, that we talk about, is really an unknown place to the archaeological record. So it's a small place. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of off the beaten path. And even there, John is trying to set the path straight. He's trying to proclaim the good news. He's trying to say to the people what they need to hear so that their hearts might be prepared to receive the Christ who is coming. I think that's what is so amazing about how John tells this story. It's both, on one hand, telling us that Jesus is a person who is great enough and powerful enough that because he's the Word of God taken flesh, that it's right for someone to proclaim his arrival. On the other hand, If that isn't done, if we aren't baptized, we're not transformed and cleaned from the inside out, then we won't be ready to know and to understand the story of Jesus Christ. And also, John is the kind of character who represents an ideal or a call or a purpose for every Christian that follows Christ. In other words, just like John was there proclaiming this, so Christians too are called to proclaim. Just as he gave testimony, so too we are to give testimony. So there are many, many layers functioning in a text like this, Clint. I think every single one of them is important because 28 verses of chapter 1, we've yet to have the first word of Jesus. That's going to come next week, Monday. Join us for that. But up to this point, we've had this beautiful prologue, the theological foundation that's been laid. Now you have the first witness to the glory of Christ, and now we're going to see Christ himself. And John's built that for us on purpose.
It's kind of a meta perspective, but one of the things that scholars wonder about is that in this opening part of the gospel, the first few chapters, there is a kind of comparison of John and Jesus. And the speculation is that John is aware of a community that lifts John the Baptist up, perhaps in his opinion, too highly. And so while he simultaneously celebrates John's role in the gospel as the herald, as the announcer, as we go through this, notice how many times John is going to say things like, I'm not the Messiah. He's greater than I am. He must turn into more while I turn into less. Any comparison that could be made is addressed by John, the author in the gospel, to make sure that his readers understand that Jesus is in the superior role here, that John is a servant, a willing one, a knowledgeable one, an incredibly important one, but that he himself understands he is a subordinate to Jesus. And that has, again, just led some to speculate that maybe John is aware of some questions along those lines, and he just wants to make sure he provides absolute clarification. That's not so much a part of the text as it is with what people have wondered about the text, but you will notice that as we go through these first couple chapters, whenever John shows up, he clearly understands his relationship to Jesus to be one of underneath, servant, and that's important in the context.
And it creates a kind of tension even within this gospel, Clint, because on one hand, John is such an important character because of the witness he gives, and on the other hand, the gospel writer John doesn't want us to give John
to overdo it,
more credence than he's due either. That's a balance, and that is intended to be held in tension. And yeah, that's absolutely purposeful. Hope that you found this conversation interesting. Hope that you might join us for the studies we continue. Indeed, next week on Monday, as we continue together, we're going to come right into the heart of Jesus' arrival and some of those first words from him, and hope that you will be part of the continuing study as we learn not just about the I am nots that we discovered today, but the I ams of Jesus to come. So subscribe so you get more of that. Like this video if you found it helpful, and we will see you next week.
Have a great weekend.